All right. So the endocrine system is basically a collective term for all the glands in the body that produce stuff that goes directly into the bloodstream instead of coming out of the body through ducts. So people would describe glands like tear glands as being exocrine glands, or the salivary glands as being exocrine glands. They secrete something that comes out through ducts into the digestive system or into this environment, onto the skin, that sort of thing. And then endocrine glands, instead of that, are releasing things directly into the system, into the inside of the body. So that's a very broad term. It's not like the digestive system and the respiratory system, where things are physically connected and carrying out a very quantifiable and cohesive set of functions. It's more like a grouping together of things that have similar or related functions from different parts of the body. So the endocrine system is something that we don't really see very much in the regular course of having human bodies and doing regular human things. We don't really see these glands normally and see what they're doing at all. So they're somewhat mysterious. They've had a lot of ideas that people have come up with about what they were doing over the course of history, some of which has been correct and some of which has been, like I said, kind of mythologized, kind of the source of myth making and of maybe misunderstandings and things like that as well. So when people think about hormones, a lot of the time they think about the reproductive functions of hormones and think of them in terms of being like testosterone's as though it were the chemical embodiment of the male principle, and estrogen is the chemical embodiment of the female principle. And that's really like, it's not just an oversimplification, it's actually wrong altogether. I mean, it's kind of, you can kind of see where they get the idea, but it's not really how it works. And in truth, male and female people have estrogen and testosterone, and everybody needs both, even though testosterone is responsible for some of the things that people think of as being primarily male characteristics, like facial hair and chest hair. And estrogen is responsible for the development of things like breasts that people think of as being primarily a female thing. Although, really there are plenty of women out there with facial or chest hair, or men out there with breast development, and it's not even weird. It's just within the realm of variation in what you see in people. It's not what's idealized, but it's not strange either, or it's not that unusual. So in reality, hormones do a lot of different things. They regulate metabolism, and that's really the most huge and most overarching version of what they do, is that they regulate metabolism. They control what resources get allocated for what tasks within the body. Previously, when we were talking about the skeletal system, we talked some about how hormones can determine whether calcium is being deposited in the bones or whether it's being released from the bones. That's an example of what I'm talking about. They allocate and move around these resources in the body. Hormones are largely what determines when somebody eats food. It determines whether they store it as fat or burn it as energy. It also determines how hungry people are. All sorts of things are regulated by the endocrine system. And the passage of time in the body is very much marked by changes in the endocrine system. So when you think about what we think of as the stages of life in the human body, like the difference between childhood and adulthood and old age, those are primarily differences in what the endocrine system is doing at those various points in people's lives. So it's very influential in that sort of thing. And it's very influential in terms of how the body nourishes itself, what happens to nutrients once they are consumed. And it has a lot to do with how the body responds to various different stresses and stimuli. So in a sense, the endocrine system is, it's a system of feedbacks where there will be, for instance, the body will produce a certain hormone for the purpose of influencing behavior or influencing how the body works. And then when that has achieved its goal, there's usually something that happens to sort of shut it off. And that's what I mean by feedback. There are systems where the body might produce a hormone like ghrelin, which creates hunger. And then when the blood sugar goes up after a meal, the body produces another substance called leptin, which sort of switches off the hunger. And so there are different things that that interact with each other that give people motivations or urges, things like that, that are controlled by the endocrine system. So in a way, it's almost like it mirrors the nervous system in influencing the choices that people make, in influencing what people's motivations and drives are. And then it also has a lot to do with, like I said, how resources are allocated within the body, and what metabolism, in terms of breaking down and building up different substances, what sorts of metabolism is going on in the body. So that's a lot of huge generalizations, but I'm going to get into some more specifics about that as we go along. So there are glands all over people's bodies, and in this session, I'm just going to talk about some of the main ones, or some of the ones that are most noticeable clinically, that are most significant in terms of life changes that people go through and health challenges that people might have. The first part that I want to talk about, the first gland that I want to talk about, is the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is very hidden. It is inside the skull. It is at the base of the brain, and there's a bone called the sphenoid bone, which is part of the skull. And at the top of the sphenoid bone, there's a little cup-shaped structure called the sella turcica. Sella turcica means Turkish saddle, I believe, but it's a little saddle-like or cup-like structure at the top of this very delicate bone, and it's the container for the pituitary, in the same way that the cranium is a container for the brain. It's just a skeletal structure that the pituitary gland can sit in, and that's held in place by. And this bone moves when we breathe and when we talk, and some other things. It has some effect on the movement of fluid around the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is very small. People would often compare it to the size of a pea, but it's really kind of, I mean, peas come in a lot of different sizes, so it's kind of, it's very small, even compared to most peas. It's kind of a little bit smaller than that, and it produces hormones that control other endocrine glands for the most part. It also produces human growth hormone, which is involved in bone growth and basically involved in the growth of the body in general. Somatotropin is the other name for it. But human growth hormone is what makes our bones grow when we're children, and makes our bodies grow to adult size. And then it stops having as much of a role once the bones have reached their full length and the kind of growth plates have closed, the solid parts of the bones have. Sorry, just a second. Once the solid parts of the bones have grown together, there's not much more potential for the bones to get any longer. Human growth hormone is still present. It's still involved in tissue healing. It's somewhat involved in metabolism and production of energy in ways that aren't necessarily really thoroughly understood, but it is still present in the body. But the main thing that is noticeable about it, the thing that's most noticeable about what it does, is that it influences bone growth and influences people developing to their adult height. And as you know, most of that happens fairly, well, it happens throughout childhood, right? You have a newborn baby, and by the time it's 2, it's maybe twice the size that it was when it was born, as far as height goes. And then maybe by the time it's full grown, it's twice that size again. Usually somewhere in our early teens or a little before, we're almost full adult size. Sometimes there's a little bit of continued growth after that, but it's pretty, small for most people. So there are sometimes people who have a later growth spurt than that, but usually right around the early stages of adolescence, people reach their full adult height, and then they put on mass after that, but not really, they don't get much taller. So that's the pituitary that's responsible for that part of things. The pituitary also kind of determines when the process of puberty starts, determines when the ovaries or the testes start producing other hormones that will be involved in the reproductive system and in development of secondary sex characteristics. So it kind of sets that scenario in motion. And a little before that, it also triggers the development of the adrenal glands, which start functioning in a more they function different in small children, but around the time that children start getting their permanent teeth, their adrenal glands start working differently, in a way that eventually leads to the development of adult strength and circadian rhythms and things like that. So we'll talk a little bit more about what all the adrenals do in a few minutes. But the pituitary gland puts out a lot of releasing and stimulating hormones that direct the other glands of the endocrine system to do what they do. Another example that you might see that gets looked at a lot from a clinical perspective is thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH, is one of the main things that they will measure if there's some suspicion that someone has a thyroid problem. And it is actually not produced by the thyroid, it's produced by the pituitary. It's something that the pituitary produces to tell the thyroid to get busy, tells the thyroid to make thyroxine and liothyronine and other hormones that increase or speed up the metabolism. And then once the thyroid is producing those hormones, the pituitary gland responds to those hormones by not producing as much of the stimulating hormone anymore. So in a person whose thyroid is not functioning correctly, the pituitary will just kind of produce more and more and more of this thyroid stimulating hormone because it's not getting the feedback that the thyroid substances are being released. So that TSH number on someone's lab work is normally very small, but it can actually be many times what it's supposed to be if the person doesn't have a functioning thyroid gland, or if their thyroid is not capable of functioning to the degree that it would need to in order to switch off that feedback loop. So that's the pituitary gland. It's responsible for controlling the endocrine system in general, kind of regulating or stimulating all these different glands within the endocrine system. And then right along with the pituitary gland is the pineal gland. The pineal gland is a light sensitive gland, and it has a lot to do with the circadian rhythms, with people's states of sleeping and waking, and things that the metabolism does differently in the daytime versus the nighttime. So there actually are chemical differences between how your body functions in daylight versus night, even if you're on a nocturnal schedule, even if you're on a nighttime schedule because you're working the night shift or because you're doing whatever. It's still affected by the amount of light that you get. And it's other parts of the endocrine system. So the pineal gland is often thought of as being sort of right in the middle of the forehead. It's kind of, in from there, but it's sort of in a third eye position. In some vertebrates like frogs, you can actually see at a certain stage in their development, when they're young, they actually have a visible third eye in the middle of their forehead. It's not very developed looking. It's kind of just sort of like a clear dome-shaped structure with a little dot in the middle of it. But it's basically where it's their pineal complex. So it's actually open to the surface in a way that humans isn't, because that bone grows closed in humans. That anterior fontanelle grows closed in humans shortly after we're born. Actually grows closed in frogs not that long after they're born too. It's just that their whole life is a lot shorter than ours. So anyway, that's sensitive to light and responsible for helping to regulate the circadian rhythms, by which I mean the daily cycles of the human body. And then in the neck, in front of the throat, you have the thyroid gland and the parathyroid glands. And they work together, or kind of they balance each other out a bit in terms of what the hormones they produce are trying to get to happen in the body. Oh, another thing that the pituitary produces, before I move on from that area, another thing that the pituitary produces is a hormone called prolactin. Prolactin is called prolactin because it stimulates lactation, and it's just sort of a short protein molecule that acts as a hormone, acts as a signaling thing between the pituitary gland and the mammary glands. But in addition to that, it also does some other stuff in the body. It also increases, it tends to increase empathy and decrease sex drive for most people. and it's present in men and women, even though typically lactation doesn't happen in men. It doesn't tend to build up to those levels in men under normal circumstances, although it can if the pituitary gland is adversely affected by something, like if there's a pituitary tumor, for instance, you actually can get enough prolactin just for someone to start lactating without there being a normal physical reason to. But that's an unusual situation. But in the normal course of things, it's present in the body in a much lower level, and doesn't cause that, but causes or contributes to a lot of other changes in how the nervous system is working. All right, so and there are a lot of herbs. There's a whole class of herbs called galactagogues or just lactagogues, which are used to increase milk production, and they work presumably by stimulating the pituitary gland to produce more of this substance, prolactin. So the thyroid gland is in the throat or in the neck in front of the throat. The thyroid itself is often described as being sort of bow tie shaped. It's got lobes and it produces a couple of different substances. It produces thyroxine and liuthionine, which are iodine-containing substances that upregulate the metabolism. They make people feel more energetic and less hungry, and usually kind of more driven, not just more wakeful, but more motivated and driven and that sort of thing. It makes them burn calories as energy. And then the thyroid also makes calcitonin, which causes the body to deposit calcium into the bones. So it strengthens the bones. Parathyroid kind of is 4 small glands, very small glands, size of maybe a split pea or a grain of rice that are behind the thyroid gland. They produce the main hormone that they produce is called parathyroid hormone or parathormone, which does the opposite. It liberates calcium from the bones and also has an effect on metabolism, but it makes calcium available to the nervous system, to the muscles, and things like that. So it's causing the release of that calcium, which the body needs for a lot of things. And so if the thyroid gland is not functioning correctly, or if it's not in balance with the parathyroid glands, then you can get you can have too much thyroid activity, in which case a person is manic, not sleeping, losing weight, often losing hair. If you've got too little thyroid activity, you get just the opposite, which is that someone feels sluggish, they're gaining weight, they don't have any energy. So both of those are common scenarios. There's a very common condition, which is autoimmune thyroiditis, sometimes called Hashimoto's disease. I don't really like disease names that are named after people. I think that just because it doesn't really tell you anything about the disease, it's kind of some egotistical nod to some particular person. But instead of that, I prefer to use structural and functional descriptors of what is going on. So autoimmune thyroiditis, thyroid inflammation caused by the immune system malfunctioning. And in that scenario, you get an early phase in which the person has too much thyroid activity. The thyroid is inflamed and it's overproducing substances, and person is in a hyperthyroid state. And then as time goes on, more and more of the thyroid tissue is converted into scar tissue or is just destroyed completely. And then you end up having less and less thyroid function and having a hypo state, hypothyroid state. So that's a very common scenario to see. I've read some things from the late 1800s and early 1900s where they describe that situation, but they say it's a very rare situation, something that they'd included in their book because it was of academic interest, even though the typical doctor would never see that in the course of their practice. And I find that really interesting because it's quite common in the age of the world in which we find ourselves now. And I don't know if the difference is because of pollution, because of atmospheric nuclear tests during the middle of the 20th century, or what exactly it's from. Some people think it could be a viral thing, but nobody's really sure why. But it went from being a recognizable but rare disease to a very common situation over the course of the 20th century. And it can always be really hard to sort out all the confounding variables between what could be causing something like that when it emerges. But in any case, it's definitely something that if you are in clinical practice, you will see from time to time. With thyroid, there are herbs that help with thyroid function, but and in that sort of a situation where there's inflammation, there are anti-inflammatory herbs that are useful for bringing the inflammation down while the person is in the hyper type state. If that once they're into the hypo state and most of the tissue is destroyed, it's harder to help. So a lot of those people end up using synthroid or synthetic thyroid hormones, or sometimes desiccated animal thyroid, which contains the same types of hormones in it from animals, usually pigs. So there's an herb called Google that I sometimes use for people in that situation, and that's sometimes helpful in varying degrees depending on how much tissue there is left for it to support. So sometimes it's more helpful than others. So that's the thyroid gland and the parathyroid glands. And then in the chest is the thymus gland. Thymus gland is interesting. It produces immune cells. It also produces some hormonal substances, but it's mostly active up until early-ish adulthood, and then it sort of atrophies. And so it's probably part of the reason why younger adults, teenagers and younger adults, are more resilient to things like most viral infections and things like that, is because the thymus gland is still more functional than it is in a middle-aged person. It produces a type of immune cells called T cells, and it also plays some roles in regulating metabolism and in the production of other substances elsewhere in the body. The pancreas, kind of the next one down from there. Well, there's the liver and the pancreas. The liver we talked about before, so I won't talk too much about that except to just review briefly that the liver is kind of a very multifunctional organ, and that it produces cholesterol, which is the building block for, or the precursor for, a lot of different hormones in the body, a lot of steroids in the body. And so it's plays a really big role in the endocrine system and in the regulating of metabolism. And then, of course, the pancreas also regulates metabolism, and specifically it produces insulin, which helps to regulate blood sugar. That's not all it does, but that's a big part of its endocrine function. And so it's really responsible for how much, when everything is going well, it's producing insulin and it's regulating the amount of immediately available energy that is there for the body to use in the form of blood sugar, which is able to be converted to energy pretty much right away by the muscles and other organs of the body. In type 1 diabetes, something has happened to the pancreas where it's no longer capable of producing sufficient quantities of insulin. And this is probably caused by viral destruction some of the time, might be other things some of the time too. People aren't completely in agreement who study the subject about what exactly is going on there. But some of it's genetic predisposition and some of it's other stuff. But in any case, the pancreas is basically destroyed, at least to a certain extent, that it can no longer produce an adequate amount of insulin for the body to use. And that insulin brings down blood sugar. So when there's not enough insulin, there's too much blood sugar, and vice versa. In type 2 diabetes, which used to be called adult onset diabetes, but that's kind of an imprecise term because sometimes type 1 diabetes does onset during adulthood, and sometimes type 2 diabetes can start during childhood or adolescence. So, they used to call it adult onset diabetes. Now we just call it type 2 diabetes, or sometimes people will refer to it as insulin resistant diabetes, which means that the pancreas is still producing insulin, but the insulin is not having the intended effect on the cells. So it's not as able to do what it does. It's not as able to bring down the blood sugar. And when the level of blood sugar gets too high in the body, it starts causing a lot of problems, primarily, or I don't want to say primarily, but a big part of what happens is the kidneys start taking up the slack and filtering the sugar out rather than the sugar getting used. And when that happens, that's damaging to the kidneys. It's sort of like an emergency release valve. If it were to happen for a short amount of time, it wouldn't be that big of a deal. But if it goes on for months and years and so forth, it damages the kidneys. And then the kidneys are no longer as able to regulate the electrolytes in the body. The electrolytes are no longer able to control circulation, and you get bad circulation, neuropathy, kidney failure, loss of vision, all kinds of things like that. So that's kind of where that becomes destructive, and that's essentially, a misstep of the endocrine system. It's something going wrong with the endocrine system. So cinnamon is one of the herbs that I use to help increase sensitivity to insulin. And it's been pretty well researched for that use, and seems to work pretty well most of the time. Good quality cinnamon tincture is nice and slimy. More on that in a little bit. So yeah, the pancreas has a big effect on the rest of the endocrine system and the rest of the metabolism, because it's controlling how much sugar is available for the body to use. Step out here and get my charging cord. Just a minute. Starting to feel like fall here. I don't know if it's like that where everybody else is, but it's really the evenings especially are really starting to feel cool, and the days are less oppressively hot. The question of, do other slimy herbs help with pancreas? Not necessarily. Not necessarily. Some of them actually do, but it's not necessarily the sort of thing where you could say this is slimy, so that suggests that it would help. Although some of them help to change how sugar is absorbed from food too, which is an indirect way of helping with the pancreas and with blood sugar. So then the adrenal glands are another part of the endocrine system that plays a huge role in the body. And actually the kidneys play a role too. So traditionally the adrenal glands and the kidneys are sometimes thought of as a single organ. In modern Western physiology, they're not really seen that way. It's more seen as the kidneys being a separate organ. But if you've ever seen an adrenal gland, it really just looks like a triangular bit of fat on top of the kidneys. I was pretty amazed the first time that I saw one at just how insubstantial it was. Like it's just huge. It's something you could easily miss or easily think was just it's actually like fat, but it plays a huge role in how people feel, and it's kind of maybe even plays a larger role in the imagination than in reality in terms of how people feel as far as energy and fatigue and things. But it does actually play a really huge role in that too. Let me tell you a little bit more about what I mean about that. But first, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what all the adrenal glands do. So the thing that the adrenal glands are kind of famous for is they produce adrenaline, which is a defensive mechanism that the body has. Kind of drastically increases alertness, wakefulness, heartbeat. Sometimes makes people stronger or at least less responsive to pain when they're doing things, so that they can maybe, lift heavier than they normally would be able to, because they're not as aware of the fact that it's hurting their muscles to do so. Um, maybe be able to run faster and further and that sort of thing, at least just very temporarily. And it makes people's hearts go fast. And that's the thing that everybody is like really familiar with the adrenal glands is adrenaline, and that it's the fight or flight response, which also sometimes includes freezing and various other fainting, various other responses people can have. And that is one of the things that the adrenal glands do. The adrenal glands also produce cortisone. Cortisone or cortisol is named after the adrenal cortex. Cortex is a Latin word for bark, like the bark of a tree. In the case of the adrenals, the cortex is the outer layer, and that's where this is produced. And this is sort of the main steroid in the body, or the main anti-inflammatory steroid in the body. It's a strong substance that the body produces in response to stress, in response to physical damage. Like if you got in a car wreck and you got a bunch of bumps and bruises and things like that, your body would produce cortisone as a way of masking those symptoms to keep you from being as badly affected in terms of what functions you were able to do. Cortisone also makes people more wakeful. It doesn't have that heart racing stimulant effect that adrenaline has, that immediate effect, but it does make people more restless. It makes people more hungry as well, so they're taking in more energy and more calories, and it tends to make people use those calories, so people are it tends to make people have a higher blood sugar, at least temporarily. So it it kind of has the effect of masking all sorts of symptoms. And so it's something that your body uses to kind of get through a crisis situation. And in the world of therapeutic substances, there's a whole class of substances called glucocorticoids, or just corticosteroids, that are based on cortisone, that are, various different variations on the same biochemical theme as cortisone. And they're all used for inflammation and some other things along those lines. But essentially, cortisone masks the symptoms of everything. And as a result of that, people kind of look at cortisone as being, or describe it as being, a stress hormone, because when the body is under physiological or emotional stress, there's a tendency to produce more of it. And in people who are chronically under a lot of stress, physical or emotional, there can be a tendency to have a chronically elevated level of cortisone, or cortisol, if you prefer to call it that way. It's the same thing. So in the normal course of things, the amount of cortisol in your system varies throughout the day. Because it does produce restlessness, you tend not to have as much of it at night. So people will produce more of it during the day, and then that level will decline as it starts to get dark outside, usually as the sun starts to go down, and then it'll start coming back up in the morning. And in some very sick people, you can actually see a difference in their symptoms as the day progresses. People will have a hard night, and then they'll be better during the day, and then it'll get hard at night again sometimes. So if you see that in somebody, it means that basically that they're getting by on their own steroids, suppressing the symptoms of what's going on with them. So sometimes in the world of alternative health, there's been this theory that people call adrenal burnout or adrenal fatigue, where the idea that people who are chronically fatigued, that what's going on with them is that their adrenal glands are no longer able to keep up, that they've, basically overexerted themselves to the point where they're not able to regulate the daily cycles of wakefulness and rest in the same way. And so people are just exhausted all the time. And this was kind of something that somebody came up with as a theory that seemed to, as a hypothesis that seems to fit the observable clinical data. But more recently, attempts to measure this have kind of found that that's usually not really what's going on, that a lot of the time people are exhausted, but if you actually measure their cortisol, it's pretty normal, or it's within the normal range. And so it's not necessarily that their adrenals are burned out or that they're no longer able to produce these substances anymore. It's just other stuff. It's just, they're exhausted, and maybe the adrenals are no longer covering it up, but it's not necessarily an actual deficiency of the adrenal glands. There are a lot of herbs out there that people might think of as being for the adrenal glands based on the idea that they do help with energy, but it's just as likely that they're having an effect on the liver, the kidneys, various other parts of the body that are involved in regulating the energy in the body. So it's not to say that the clinical approaches around these things are wrong, but that the languaging around it is kind of based on something that people assumed was going on that doesn't turn out to necessarily reflect the physical reality of things. So yeah, the adrenaline and then the cortisone are a couple of the main things that the adrenal glands produce. They are capable of producing other substances as well, though. The adrenal glands can produce thyroxine, just like the thyroid can. They can also produce estrogen and testosterone. They're not the main sites for producing these substances, but they are capable of producing them. So they're actually kind of very versatile pieces of endocrine tissue that can do a lot of different things if the body needs them to. Let's see. So yeah. So then in addition to those, further down in the body, you have what people kind of refer to as the reproductive system, but we don't mostly use it for reproduction. It does all sorts of other things, and so it's kind of a very mechanistic or very I don't know. It's kind of thinking of it just as being the reproductive system is sort of oversimplifying or kind of putting something on people that's not necessarily all that natural, because a lot of people never reproduce, but they still need these systems, right? They still play an important role. So the ovaries and the uterus, or testes and prostate gland, if so equipped, they have overlapping functions, even though they do different things in terms of producing gametes and producing reproductive cells. But both the ovaries and the testes produce testosterone and estrogen and androgens and some other steroidal hormones that affect a lot of different things throughout the body, that affect sex drive, but also bone density, heart function, energy, lots of other things. Prostaglandins, which are produced in the cervix and also the prostate, are kind of regulate inflammation in the body, sometimes increase the immune response and things like that. So all of these glands have they have a variety of functions too. And if you read up about them, most of the focus tends to be on sex and reproduction, which of course that's it's an important part of what they do, but it's also not the whole story by any means. These organs tend to be less productive after middle age. So the decrease in their output has a lot to do with some of the changes that we would associate with old age, changes in voice, changes in skin quality, changes in bone density. So people get frail and they get creaky voiced and they get wrinkled, and probably has to do with hair color as well, although that's not necessarily very well understood. Why people's hair turns gray when they get old. Not everybody's, but some people, and of course, some hair more than others. I got gray facial hair, but the hair on my head doesn't have much gray in it at all, and so it's kind of not real well understood, but has presumably something to do with changes in endocrine function as we get older. So yeah, it's important to keep in mind that those organs do a lot more than reproduction, and they're kind of not vital in the sense that we can't live without them, but important in terms of helping to regulate metabolism and keeping the body functioning in the healthiest way possible. And again, with those, just like with the adrenal glands, there are certain herbs people might call adaptogens, or sometimes people would say aphrodisiacs, although that's kind of a dated term. Not people don't really use that term very much anymore, at least not in medical writing or anything like that. But there are herbs that positively affect the pelvic organs and the reproductive system. So we've talked in the past about red raspberry, for instance, which helps to increase circulation to the uterus. It'll actually do that for the prostate gland as well. There are other herbs like pumpkin seed, which kind of have this reputation as like helping to preserve testosterone in the body, helping to keep it from getting broken down as easily. So they're useful for that. Saw palmetto also has the reputation of doing that, but it's actually a very weak herb. It's more like a food, and in its native range where it grows naturally, the people who have traditionally lived there have used it more like a food rather than like a strong medicine. But of course, it is some of both, like so many other things. Ginseng is an herb that kind of, people think of ginseng as being, or people market ginseng as being like a male reproductive tonic or something like that, like it increases sex drive. And it does increase sex drive, but it actually does that for some men and some women, but not everybody. So it's really kind of more of a tonic for the endocrine system. And it helps with a lot of different things. It helps with people kind of feeling the effects of age less than they normally would, is kind of one of the traditional uses of it. But then it also helps with digestion and metabolism and things like that. So it's kind of people market it as being like more sexually focused thing because I think that's what sells, but actually it's a kind of its traditional uses are that it's more like a tonic for the energy and vitality of the whole body. So that's it's an herb that's kind of, it's actually harvestable right now, but it's very environmentally sensitive. And I think that people should only harvest it from the wild if they have a particular stand that they're planning on working with long term, and not harvest much of it, because it takes several years. People say 6 years, but it can be 12 for the plant to go from seed to being a mature plant. I think in the plants that I work with, the ginseng plants that in the stands that I work with, I went and looked at one of them this past weekend, and the plants that are old enough to harvest now are actually the ones that were planted 8 years ago. So I think just the difference of having a couple hotter and drier summers than usual makes a difference of it taking a couple more years for it to reach maturity. So that might be, as we're seeing kind of a trend towards hotter summers, that might be something that becomes more the usual. But the herbs that the ginseng that is growing from seeds that I planted 6 years ago does not look like full-grown ginseng right now. So that's just something to be aware of. That's not always as short a thing as you might be led to believe, and that as the climate changes, that sort of thing might change along with it. But it's a very slow growing, very environmentally sensitive herb. And a lot of the things that are used for the endocrine system are, black cohosh is another example. Black cohosh is something that grows in the woods here. And it's mostly, it's very widely used for menopausal symptoms. And there are a number of studies, some with positive results and some not, which suggests that it's, has a lot to do with quality about it. But it's another herb that is slow growing, takes a few years, not as long as ginseng, but takes a few years to grow to be a mature plant. It's a perennial woodland root crop. And on the extreme end of that scale would be lady slipper, which takes basically an entire human generation to go from seed to flower. And at one point, it was a very popular tonic for increasing fertility, and it was harvested nearly to extinction. It was used for increasing fertility, but it was also used for controlling seizures as well, and for the nervous system as well. So anyway, that's something that you probably just shouldn't harvest at all. Just if you know where it grows, just let it grow. Yeah, a lot of the herbs that work on the endocrine system do take a long time to grow, but not all of them. Raspberry you can harvest multiple times a year, and it doesn't take a long time to grow or anything like that. Red clover, which we talked about before, also has some effect on the endocrine system and is an annual. It's very easy to grow in a short amount of time. Lady slipper and wintergreen. Yeah, lady slipper and wintergreen often grow together. They like the same sorts of things, the same sorts of sandy soil, often in mixed woodland that's got some conifers and some broadleaf trees in them. So, I mean, wintergreen grows in a lot more places than lady slipper does, but you'll often find orchids growing where wintergreen grows, including Goodyear rattlesnake plantain, which is one of our many tiny orchids whose foliage is more noticeable than their flowers. Lady slippers have huge showy flowers, so they're not necessarily in that category. But yeah, you can find them growing in eastern Kentucky in areas that haven't been disturbed in a while. We have like 5 different species of lady slipper here in Kentucky. We have a few different species that grow here. But pink and yellow are the kind of most common ones. All right. So I wanted to talk about a couple different herbs. One of the herbs I wanted to talk about this time is cinnamon. Cinnamon is bark of a tree. Really, it's the bark of a couple different kinds of trees, practically speaking. In the writings of Herodotus, which were written about 24 centuries ago, he's talking about different herbs and different spices that the Greeks were getting from the Arabs at that time in history. So already by this time, there's extensive ongoing trade relationships where herbs are being traded, medicinal plants, medicinal and culinary plants are being traded over, from one continent to the next. And he talks about 2 different things that are both called cinnamon if you buy them from the store here. One of them is actually cassia, Cinnamomum cassia, and the other one is real cinnamon, true cinnamon, Cinnamomum zeylanicum is the Latin name of it. Of course, they didn't have those names. They were just called cinnamon and cassia in his writings. So with cassia, he says that it grows in swamps and that it's hard to harvest because of the mosquitoes and bats and things that would attack people when they were out in the swamp. And then with cinnamon, he says, and this is a really great story. He says, he describes it as a likely story, but he says that they don't really know where cinnamon grows. Not only the Greeks don't know, but the people that the Greeks were buying the cinnamon from claimed that they didn't know where it grows, but that giant birds used it to build their nests out of. And they would build these nests on the side of cliffs with branches of cinnamon trees. And the only way you could harvest it was to chop up an ox and leave the bones out for these giant birds. And the birds would take the bones back to their nest, and the weight of the bones would collapse the nest. And then people could go and gather the sticks that had fallen from the collapsed nest of these giant birds. And that's how they harvested cinnamon back in those days. I think that they really just, came up with an outlandish story to justify a premium price, probably. But cinnamon grows in the swamp too, just like cassia does. They're very similar trees, and the bark is peeled off of it, and as it dries, it rolls up. And so if you see cinnamon sticks, that's just like a strip of bark that has curled up as it's dried. And then of course that can be ground into powder. And let's see, this is some, so this is some cinnamon tincture, and it's just kind of recently been set up. So it's not at full strength yet, but you can see the orange color kind of coming out of the cinnamon and into the menstruum, into the liquid. And along with that, there's a lot of soluble fiber, which leads to a thick mucilaginous consistency. And really, it's not thick enough yet to really be able to see it, but it's kind of gets, when it's at its full strength, gets kind of thick and stringy. And so cinnamon has kind of tendency to produce movement in the body. So earlier we talked about stagnation, right? And cinnamon works on all sorts of stagnation. If it's taken internally, it works on food stagnation. It's that gelatinous property helps to soften up the stools, and the spiciness of it helps to increase circulation and increase movement of juices in the digestive system. So it will work against constipation. It'll also, because it's spicy, will cause drainage of the sinuses. Also, because it's warming, it will open up the blood vessels and allow blood circulation to happen. So it can actually produce movement in a lot of parts of the body. I have used cinnamon. One thing that I often use cinnamon for is helping people regain sensitivity in their intestines after they've had a long period of severe constipation. So sometimes, and you see this mostly in children, old people, and people who have been on opiates for a prolonged amount of time, you'll sometimes get a situation where somebody's bowels have been so impacted and so slowed down for so long that they're kind of stretched out and they don't have a lot of feeling in them. And it can make it difficult for people to regain normal bowel function. And cinnamon is really helpful for that, because it's helping to increase circulation into that tissue and increase the movement of fluid into that tissue. And so it's helping things move along, but it's also increasing sensitivity as it does it. And it's also, because it's stimulating the circulation into the intestines, it's also helping with the absorption of nutrients, which can be adversely affected in that scenario. So it actually has multiple different good things that it's doing there that tend to counteract some of the effects that you get from either from long-term opiate use, or just from, in the case of children and old people, just having a dry constitution and not having a lot of movement happening in the bowels sometimes for a long time. So it can help to reestablish good bowel movement habits. And usually in that scenario, I would be using it as a powder. One of the ways I like to use cinnamon is by mixing powder with honey and having the person take it internally. Taking it, you can also take it in capsule form with water, or in tincture form like what I have here. So it's it's usable in a variety of different scenarios like that. It's also possible to make liniment with cinnamon in oil. The cinnamony stuff, the stuff that gives it its flavor, is oil soluble. So it will disperse in water, it will disperse in alcohol and water, or it will disperse in hot water by just without the alcohol, because the slimy stuff helps to bind the oily part and carry it into the water. But it will also dissolve in oil. And in that scenario, I like to just use chips of cinnamon, not powder, but very small broken up pieces, and then heat them in oil, and using about 4 times as much oil as cinnamon, and then let that sit overnight and then strain it. So, bring it to a hot temperature, like where the oil just starts to sizzle, then take it off of the heat and let it sit overnight and then strain it. And that will get a lot of the, excuse me, that will get a lot of the volatile oils out of the cinnamon into the oil, into the carrier oil. And then that can be used topically to increase circulation and increase sensitivity. Like if somebody has numb fingers or toes from bad circulation, it's really helpful for that. It's also a really nice antifungal. So if you use it with sesame oil, which is also an antifungal, that's can be a good way to prepare that. And it doesn't smell bad. It has a nice cinnamony smell to it. And if somebody's got something like ringworm or athlete's foot, jock itch, anything like that, it's soothing. And it also is a pretty strong thing for helping to get rid of the fungal infection itself. It can be used on oral thrush too, which is in the mouth. Yeah, so it's a good herb to know about, good herb to work with. Something you can not really wild harvest in this part of the world, but in some places you can. It is kind of an environmentally sensitive herb because it is a large mature tree by the time that you're harvesting from it. You don't want to kill it by harvesting it wrongly. But, like I said, that usually doesn't really come up for most of us because we're not going out and harvesting our own cinnamon by tricking birds into taking bones into their nests, or by going into the swamp with special veils and suits to keep the bugs from biting us or anything like that. Yeah, the cinnamon from Sri Lanka, formerly known as Ceylon, has had a reputation for hundreds of years as being kind of some of the best cinnamon. There's really good cinnamon grown in Vietnam also. And sometimes if you buy cinnamon, they'll say that it has like a certain quantity of volatile oils in the cinnamon. And 3% is good, better than 3% is excellent, less than that's kind of not so good. So powdered grocery store cinnamon is probably not the best stuff as far as medicinal qualities go, but it's it can be adequate, and if that's what people have access to, then it's still got a lot of the properties it needs, because the volatile compounds are part of the story, and those evaporate more quickly from a powdered herb than they would from an herb that was in larger pieces. But the soluble fiber, the slipperiness of it, is another part of the story, and that doesn't go away no matter how you store it or process it, unless you get it wet or something like that. But for the most part, that's a very durable component. All right, and then another herb that I wanted to talk about today is valerian. Valerian is mostly a garden plant in our area. It's native to Europe. Occasionally, it will grow as an escapee from cultivation here in North America, but not so often. It often likes to grow in damp ground. It has sort of a spreading umbel-shaped white inflorescence and divided leaves. And then the most characteristic thing about valerian that people tend to remember is that the root has a strong smell to it. When it's fresh, it has sort of a fruity smell to it. And then it also has sort of a funky bass note that some people describe as being like feet. I don't really think it smells much like feet, but I think it just kind of, it has its own sort of dank, funky smell to it. But when it's new, when it's fresh, it also has like a fruity higher note to it that tends to be there, which I kind of think smells like grape soda or grape candy, not really like grapes, but like yeah, grape flavored candy. And that's kind of what I think of really good valerian smelling like. It's hard to dry it well enough that it retains that smell for very long. The funkier smell to it, though, sticks around forever. One of my favorite stories to tell is that I have sometimes guest lectured at the University of Transylvania here in Lexington, which is Transylvania was built in the late 1700s and was the first university west of the Appalachian Mountains in the United States. And they have some apothecary jars there that are from Transylvania's medical school when it had a medical school. Its medical school closed down because of the Civil War. So it closed down in 1860 or so. And they had this brilliant herbalist who worked there for a while called Rafinesque, but he was really sort of an impossible person to get along with. And so he ended up getting fired and allegedly putting a curse on the university, which caused one of the buildings to burn down repeatedly. But anyway, whether he really cursed it or whether that is just a story they came up with later, he left and moved to Philadelphia, where he eventually died. And then they found his bones and brought them back, and he's buried at Transylvania now. But in 1860 or so, the medical school closed down. The apothecary jars got packed away, and in the early 2000s, they got unpacked and put on display. And I first had the chance to smell the valerian in their apothecary jar in, I think, 2007. I'm not exactly sure if that's the right year. Maybe it was 2008, somewhere around there. And I opened it and smelled it, and it still smelled just like valerian. And then a decade or so later, actually in 2020, I came back and smelled it again, and it still smelled pretty strongly like valerian, even though it's been in the apothecary jar for over 150 years now. And so the actual isovaleric acid, the part of it that gives it the funky foot-like smell, sticks around for a really long time, longer than any of us can hope to stick around, if it is stored well. Yeah, so it's actually not Valium that they made out of it. So people think that it's Valium because the name Valium is probably based on valerian. Valerian was a popular herb when Valium came out, but they're not really that similar. The drug that's most similar to valerian is called Depakote, and it's a seizure drug. Depakote is propylpentanoic acid, and then valerian is pentanoic and isopentanoic acid. So they're very similar. They're all in the same little family of substances, and they all work by increasing how much voltage has to be in a nerve cell before it will fire, essentially, which both valerian and Depakote have been used to control seizures. Valerian was kind of the drug of choice for controlling seizures in the 1800s. And then other things became more popular. But for many centuries, it's been used to calm the nervous system and to decrease spasms in the muscles. And Sometimes people take it as a sleep aid. I don't really like it as a sleep aid because there are lots of other herbs that produce sleep that are that's closer to normal sleep. Sometimes when people take valerian to go to sleep, they have weird dreams, but it is very calming. For some people, it seems to work better than just about anything else for sleep. So it's not the first thing that I usually try, which would be more along the lines of chamomile or tilia, or maybe passion flower, but it is a really widely used thing. But it's great for anxiety. It's great for calming the nerves. It's great for calming and relaxing the muscles. And basically the worst thing it does to just about anybody is make them feel drowsy and weird. So that's not so bad for a sedative, since that's kind of partly what they're for. So yeah, valerian is a pretty good herb with a very long history of use. Just like with cinnamon, it was around in ancient Greece. People were writing about it back then. It was not only around, but very widely used. In addition to its effects for the nervous system, it was also used as an herb for the eyes. Either something soaked in valerian tea can be put on the eyes if they're itching and burning. There was also an ointment that was made with valerian, sliced valerian, cooked in oil, that was used as an eye ointment, called Phrygian balm. And that's something that's was a popular remedy in the ancient world. So used for irritation of the eyes, also sometimes used for helping restore the vision if the vision had been lost as a result of a fever or an eye injury or something like that. Didn't necessarily work on just age-related nearsightedness or anything like that, but it did work on a lot of things, because a lot of the time people's eyes were subjected to a lot of dust and occupational hazards and things like that. Nobody wore goggles to work or anything like that at the time. At least not much of anybody did. So it was used for a lot of things like that, where somebody's eyes might be having a hard time because of injuries, infections, things like that. So valerian is pretty useful for that, and I've used it a lot for people who have very bad allergic itching and burning in the eyes that seems to not be responding to regular antihistamine types treatments and things like that. So it's useful for that. People have also used it as a hair product. I've never really tried it for that. I find it interesting, but the idea of a hair balm that smells like valerian just kind of seems like not that great to me. There are some other herbs like spikenard that might provide similar benefits and not smell quite so funky. So I would probably be inclined to try those first. Could valerian thicken hair? Supposedly. Like I said, I haven't really tried it. Yeah, I'm using valerian oil and rubbing it into the scalp and combing it through the hair is supposed to help hair growth and help to strengthen the hair and restore darker color to it in people that are starting to go gray. I can't personally attest to how effective it is, but I do know that the history of use is there. So yeah, it's a good herb in Irish traditional medicine. It's also kind of used to help people, to help people with fear, but also to help people coming off of alcohol to help people to detox from alcohol or not have urges for it and things like that, which is, something that's definitely it's been tended to be a high rate of alcoholism in Ireland, as there is in many colonized or formerly colonized countries. So that's something that people have found that's been helpful for that situation. So a lot of time people have people who are used to drinking when they're anxious, or even used to drinking just sort of as a maintenance thing for their nervous system, so that they can, they just kind of emotionally rely on it. And valerian can sometimes help to fill that niche without containing alcohol. So topical for pain, yes, it can relax pain, some types of pain topically. It's definitely can be used for spasms in muscles, and then it does help soothe injuries and things like that, although there are a lot of other things that I use for that. But the Phrygian balm, the valerian ointment that is used on the eyes, that same sort of thing can be used for other injuries on the body as well. So yeah, valerian, the main part of the plant that is used is the root, although there is some of the effective stuff in the leaves and flowers as well. So it wouldn't be unreasonable if you were growing it yourself to use the leaves and flowers as well as the root. The root keeps better. So if you were like transporting it or storing it in raw herb form, the root is going to withstand a lot more passage of time than the leaves and flowers would. And that's probably the main reason why with that and a lot of other roots, that the root was the main commercial product rather than the leaves and flowers. Echinacea is the same way, golden seal is the same way. They all have the same stuff in the leaves and flowers that they have in the roots, but it's a lot more delicate, and it doesn't, because it's softer plant material, it doesn't hold the medicine as well for as long. So, any questions about either of those herbs? So one question is, how often do I suggest applying cinnamon or cinnamon/sesame seed oil for athlete's foot fungus, and when to see improvement? I usually would have someone do that twice a day, and I would expect to see improvement within a few days. Sometimes after just a day, sometimes after 2 or 3 days, but pretty quickly, you can usually start seeing some improvement, and they can usually start feeling some improvement. Because a lot of the time, foot fungus or any kind of skin fungus tends to be itchy, and it makes that itchiness go away because it disrupts the physical function, the physiology of the fungus, so that it's not producing the stuff that makes the itching as much anymore. So yeah, usually pretty quickly. And yeah, sometimes I find it's hard to get people to put anything on twice a day, but if you can get them to twice a day, it's really good. If they can, a lot of the time I'll say, put this on and put wool socks on over it. Wool socks will wick away moisture and keep there from being as much of the damp heat environment around the feet, and then the oil will persist, so it'll still be on there hours later. But if you can get them to apply it twice a day, that's really good. So one other thing that I want to say to everybody is that where most of us are, it's fall right now. It's kind of what's traditionally been the harvest season between mid to late August up really into October. There's a lot of stuff that is harvestable, a lot of herbs right now that you could go out and get large amounts of, like goldenrod flowers or jewelweed or black walnut, which we've talked about before, lobelia. There's just tons of stuff out there right now that you can really just go out and get, a grocery bag full of easily. So I would encourage everybody to try and set aside some time to go and pick some herbs. This is the harvest time, and that harv in the word harvest has a lot to do with the word herb too. They're like kind of the same word if you go far enough back in the English language, I believe. So it's kind of the herb time. I mean, there's stuff to gather all year, but this time of year, there's a whole lot of stuff that's harvestable. So, depending on what's growing where you live, what's growing where you're growing, there can be a lot of things that are there for the taking right now in pretty, decent quantities. Like I mentioned, raspberry leaf. Raspberries are done bearing fruit for the year. So you can go out and harvest the leaves without doing any harm to the plant, and dry some and save them up for all next year. Same with black walnut hulls. There's so many out there. You can gather up black walnut hulls and make some tincture that'll last you for the next couple of years, and be a good learning experience and a good way to connect with the landscape that you live in, and that sort of thing. Yes, pawpaws. You might have pawpaws available where you are. Persimmons are, some trees are actually already ripe. Some are starting to get ripe now. Some people think that you have to wait until after the frost. It's not really true. Sometimes it happens to be after frost, but the ripening process isn't necessarily dependent on the frost. So pawpaws and persimmons, which are wild edible fruits that we have here in the eastern United States, are harvestable right now. So yeah, I would strongly encourage everybody who has someplace you can go to do so, to get out to the woods, get out to the fields, find some plants growing, and just practice gathering some herbs, making some medicine out of them, drying some, tincturing some, whatever suits your needs. But I think that it's a good way to put some of what you've learned into practice, and let me know if you need any help with it. And yeah, it's a really good time to be doing it. And also, it's like not so oppressively hot out, because a month ago, if you were out in the fields for a while, it would kind of take its toll on you because it would be so hot out. But now it's, maybe in the 70s during the day and in the 50s during the evening, and you can just kind of spend some more time out without feeling like you're getting roasted alive. Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, so lots of good stuff out there. And it's a good chance to familiarize yourself with some of it, because, you know, in another couple of months, it's going to be kind of slim pickings as far as what is actually out there that can be picked. So, you know, you might want to harvest some things and dry them and maybe make them into stuff over the winter, or have them to practice with over the winter. Because, yeah, we're getting towards the end of, I mean, there's some things, at least where I live, that can be gathered all year long, but there's a lot more things right now than there are in, say, November. So I strongly encourage everyone to take advantage of that situation and go out and harvest a few different things. You know, maybe stock up your home apothecary a little bit. All right. Well, any other questions today? Next time, we're going to be talking about the immune system and some of the herbs that go along with supporting the immune system. And the immune system is even less of a system than the endocrine system is, even more vague and nebulous in its structure. But we'll be talking some about that, and after that, we'll move on from systems of the body into other areas. All right. Anything else before we go? Thank you. All right. Well, I will talk to you all soon. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone. Good night.
Good night.